Welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Mike O'Loughlin, national correspondent for American Media. Catholic bishops are meeting virtually this week, where they're discussing a number of issues, but none more talked about than a proposed statement on the Eucharist. The question that seems to be on everyone's mind is, will Catholic bishops deny communion to President Joe Biden? But maybe that's not the right question to be asking. We'll provide some context and analysis about what's actually happening, the deeper issues at play, and how we got here. Joining me today is Father Sam Sawyer, senior editor at American Media. Before we jump into our conversation, some context. Recent polling shows that U.S. Catholics either don't understand or don't agree with church teaching on the Eucharist. U.S. bishops have been talking about this polling and came up with a plan for Eucharistic revival in the church. But following the election of Joe Biden, the nation's second Catholic president, some bishops said that there needs to be more powerful statements about whether pro-choice Catholic politicians are able to receive communion. Critics of that statement fear we're about to set off another round of communion wars. While a national policy on communion seems to be off the table, there seems to be still much debate about how best to proceed on this topic. Which gets us to today. Father Sam Sawyer, senior editor at America, thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Mike.
So before we jump into what's happening at the Bishops' Conference this week, maybe you could set the stage a little bit for us. What are some of the issues at play that are being debated, that are driving this conversation about a policy or a statement on the Eucharist?
So I think it's important for us to recognize that there are two distinct yet very connected conversations that have kind of ended up overlapping here. One is that back in 2019, there was some polling that suggested that there are significant deficiencies or issues in what the average Catholic in the pew knows and believes and understands about Catholic teaching on the Eucharist. And so there's work to try to address that pastoral need, and that's been ongoing. But at the same time, after the election of Joe Biden, there was also concern expressed, particularly by a number of bishops, that the election of a pro-choice Catholic president presented a significant question about who should or should not be receiving communion, and there have been various attempts and moves to try to define that. And these two things, so on the one hand, how do we strengthen Catholic teaching on the Eucharist? And on the other hand, what does Catholic teaching on the Eucharist mean about a pro-choice Catholic politician receiving communion? They're overlapped, right? And they're certainly connected, but they're happening at the same time. And I think it's what we're seeing go on at the bishops' meeting is some people are saying these two have to be addressed together, and other people are saying that it's become so politicized that addressing the second, the question about the politicians, is going to poison any attempt to really strengthen teaching on the Eucharist.
Yeah, and of course, Catholic teaching on the Eucharist is no small matter to begin with, right? So that Catholics don't understand or don't agree with the teaching, or maybe the polling questions were not sophisticated enough to really capture what was going on there. I mean, that's a document that could span, Bible-length treatises on what it means to be a Catholic and believe in the Eucharist. And the other question is not any easier in some ways. Who should and shouldn't receive it? There's a lot of church teaching tradition about those questions that really can't be answered rather simply. And now, like you said, they're trying to do this in one document. So talk to us a little bit about what is that debate happening? Is there a call to kind of separate these issues into different teaching documents, or is it possible to do one without the other? What's happening? What are bishops saying about that?
Well, so I think the honest answer right now is we don't really know. And part of the reason we don't really know is because this has been sort of a moving target, what the bishops are actually discussing and voting on. And it seemed, in following the meeting, that even some bishops are a little bit confused about this. There's been a lot of evolution. There was, shortly after the election, there was a task force about how the bishops should engage with President Biden. And then there were some public calls for sort of a national policy on politicians and the reception of communion. And then some other bishops speaking out against the adoption of such a national policy. We then got a letter from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, setting out a process that should apply to any discussion of that. But the document that's currently under discussion would be more a teaching document and apparently not a national policy document, but it would still address this question of worthiness to receive communion, or what's often being called by a number of people now Eucharistic coherence or Eucharistic consistency. And while that is definitely a part of church teaching on the Eucharist, the question of whether or not you're ready and disposed to receive, it's not the only question, but it is the question that's grabbing sort of headline attention as the bishops are talking about this.
Yeah, and we are recording this as bishops are meeting. We don't know what the result will be yet in terms of a vote about proceeding with drafting a document. But one thing that's been clear, even in the weeks and months leading up to the meeting, and now that we've had a day of debate, is that there is quite a bit of disagreement about the best way to proceed on this issue. We've, in some sense, seen two camps kind of emerge, one that really wants to press ahead with this document, including a section that would address Catholic cultural and political leaders, and another group that wants to slow down, put the brakes on the discussion. This group points to interventions from the Vatican ahead of the meeting and an address from the papal nuncio at the meeting as saying, let's step back. We're not engaging in true dialogue here. Just on a very practical matter, meeting over Zoom with 300 people well into their 60s, 70s, 80s is not the easiest task for any organization, and it's proving not to be particularly easy for Catholic bishops either. But there is disagreement and debate. But a question, something I find interesting is a debate the same as dialogue? And are we seeing dialogue happening? Are we seeing the kind of dialogue that Pope Francis has been urging throughout his pontificate among U.S. bishops whenever there's a disagreement? Is that happening? And is it even possible?
I think that's a great question. It's also a terrifically difficult question to ask. I mean, on the one hand, certainly what's been criticized at the meeting as being a little bit, parliamentary tactics, et cetera, wouldn't count as dialogue. But on the other hand, Pope Francis has also said that, he expects that synodality in the church, this path of dialogue and greater conversation and openness, will be messy at times. So it's certainly possible that what we're seeing is just dialogue in its opening and messy stages right now. I think one of the challenges is that there are bishops who hold the position that in order to dialogue about this, we need to slow it down. We need to have more time to learn what each other think, and particularly to learn it outside the limitations of a virtual, Zoom-driven meeting. And then there are other people who would say, no, we are dialoguing about this, and in order to keep the dialogue going, we need to move through the steps that the bishops always take to draft one of these documents and adopt a teaching document eventually. But I also think there's some significant, there are very different viewpoints on what actual pastoral need is being addressed here. Right? So there are some bishops who are focused on the pastoral need of that it is clearly incoherent with the teaching of the church for a Catholic to advocate for and advance the cause of legal abortion, right? Which President Biden does. And so that presents a clear rupture with the teaching of the church, and they would say the pastoral need is that absolutely has to be addressed. And there are other people, other bishops, I think, who generally would want to slow the dialogue down and open up more space for it to develop, who would say, well, yes, that's an issue, but addressing it at the communion rail by insisting on who can and cannot receive is just going to lead to deeper politicization and disunity in the life of the church, and that would be the pastoral problem then. So it's kind of, part of the question is, is the pastoral problem disunity that's already there, and there's some way to fix it by addressing the question of who can receive communion? Or is the pastoral problem that attempting to do that would actually make the disunity worse, not better?
Sure. And through my own reporting, talking to a number of bishops, talking to church analysts, there seems to be broad consensus among bishops about belief in the Eucharist, of course, and then also on the issue of abortion. And I think all bishops who identify as pro-life. The question really comes down to, do bishops want to have this confrontational approach to communion? As you said, do they want to solve this issue at communion, or is there a different way? We seem to see signs from the Vatican that they might prefer a less confrontational approach than a policy or a document banning politicians from communion. And also that this seems to be a fairly uniquely American approach to this issue. Certainly, we're not the only country where there's Catholic politicians who support abortion rights. Yet this kind of intense debate about denying communion seems to be happening here. And one question, or one issue that is of interest to me, is what is the Vatican asking the United States bishops to do? We talked a little bit about the letter from the head of the Congregation from the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Daria, but we also heard an address from the papal nuncio to U.S. bishops yesterday. And there does seem to be a call for more dialogue. There does seem to be a call for unity, which suggests in a diplomatic way that bishops haven't arrived at that point yet, that the unity, the consensus that traditionally would need to be present before moving ahead with a statement like that is lacking. What did you see from the letter from Cardinal Daria or from the address from the papal nuncio?
So let me address Cardinal Ladaria's letter first. So Cardinal Ladaria sent a letter in response to the news from Archbishop Gomez, the president of the conference, that this was on the agenda for discussion. And at that point, what was potentially on the agenda for discussion was a national policy on the reception of communion. And that letter did a number of things. One thing it laid out, probably the most significant thing it did, was it laid out sort of a recommended process for what Ladaria called an extensive and serene dialogue in two stages. First, a dialogue among the bishops themselves to reach unity on the underlying doctrinal questions and the way they were going to approach them. And then after that had been done, a second stage of dialogue Ladaria called for with the bishops engaging with Catholic politicians who were pro-choice to understand their position and whether or not they fully understood church teaching on the matter. Now, one of the things that came out of the first day's discussions at the USCCB meeting is that now that this document isn't apparently proposing a national policy, but rather is going to be a teaching document that addresses, the underlying theological ideas around what disposition to receive communion is and who should and should not present themselves for communion. Maybe, the question is, well, does Ladaria's recommended process still apply? And we don't have a clear question on that, and I doubt Cardinal Ladaria is going to weigh back in with a second letter or anything. So, this might be more about sort of spirit or letter of the law kind of question. But we did also see, at the opening of the meeting yesterday, an address by the nuncio, the Pope's ambassador to the United States, who, speaking to the bishops, again, encouraged them in a process of dialogue that he said was the method of Jesus himself. That was the method Jesus adopted of dialogue and encounter with people. And one of the things he said, which I don't know, certainly seems to me to be encouragement to slow down a little bit. He quoted an old adage that he said his father used a lot, that, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together, talking about the church as a family. And that, to me, that certainly suggested that the Vatican would like to see this slow down and allow more space for conversation among bishops, perhaps.
And of course, this conversation is taking place in a concrete reality. The United States is politically quite polarized. The church also is experiencing some of that polarization in this country. The run-up to this debate has not been free from bishops trying to influence the debate. We've seen a handful of bishops very clearly state that they do not think President Biden should receive communion. And an interesting observation on the first day of the meeting came from Cardinal Blaise Cupich in Chicago, who said that regardless of what ends up actually being in the document, we had one bishop say that it was no longer a policy, it was more of a resource. Cardinal Cupich said that the document has been colored by this debate already, that the politics around communion and abortion are going to influence whatever's in this document. So he urged caution because of that, because of the reality of how the document would be received. And I'm curious, we don't know what will be in this document. We do have a proposed outline Most of the document will be devoted to Eucharistic teaching, but there is a section that will be addressed to Catholic cultural, political, and church leaders and their public witness to the faith. But I'm curious, is there a concern? Is there a valid concern that any beautiful theology about the Eucharist might be lost and kind of distilled down to a couple lines about Catholic politicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a concern, and I would point to as a sort of parallel example what we've seen happen a number of times now with the bishop's document on voting and Catholic participation in political life, forming consciences for faithful citizenship. That when that document whenever it gets discussed at the bishop's meeting, the headlines about it are always about the fight over, most recently about the language around abortion being the preeminent priority for Catholic involvement in political life in the mind of the bishops. And I think it's simply one of the challenges of the church in the contemporary world that whatever the bishops are doing as a body is going to be distilled down into a couple headlines. The Catholic media usually engages a little bit more deeply with it, but certainly in the secular media, you're going to get 1 or 2 days of the news cycle, 1 or 2 headlines out of it. And for many Catholics, that's going to be one of their primary, if not only, exposures to what the bishops are saying and doing about this. So you can have a document that's got very rich and beautiful teaching, and that does serve as a resource that, that pastors and directors of religious education and people involved in faith formation will draw on for what they do at the life, at the level of the life of the individual parish. But what's happening nationally, sort of like the way the narrative evolves around the church is often driven by the most contentious thing in the document, even if it's not necessarily the most important or core thing in the document. And I think that is a circle that the church has not figured out how to square yet. And remains a challenge, not just around this, this particular issue of abortion in the Eucharist, but remains a challenge whenever the church is trying to speak on matters of public import.
So we began the conversation by saying the question on everyone's mind is, will Catholic bishops vote to deny President Joe Biden communion? I'm going to ask you a little tongue-in-cheek, are they going to do that? We know the answer is no, but can you explain why?
Yeah, well, certainly not, because there is actually no mechanism in the life of the church for a national conference of bishops to vote directly on such a decision. That's a decision that would lie with the individual bishop in whose diocese someone would be receiving communion, or with the bishop in whose diocese a given politician lives. And even if they did want to vote on something like that, there would be multiple stages of that process, which would involve a 2/3 majority to approve it, and then it would go to Rome for Rome's approval, et cetera. And there's no real way in the life of the church for the bishops to vote directly on that question. What is going to happen, though, is what the bishops do on this and the way the bishops decide to proceed with this document will be covered in the media, will be headlined as the bishops either moving towards or away from making some kind of fundamental statement on whether or not President Biden should receive communion. And that's certainly not accurate, and there are levels at which it's not fair, definitely, but it is, I think, a pastoral challenge for the church right now, that there are going to be some people who are going to be scandalized if the church doesn't clearly indicate that there are real problems with a pro-choice Catholic politician who is continuing to advance the cause of legal abortion, receiving communion as if that's not an issue. And there are other people, there are also going to be ways in which it's a real problem if the communion rail becomes this zone of political debate that seems very partisan to a substantial portion of the church.
And we should say, for his part, President Joe Biden, who has attended Mass more or less weekly since his inauguration in January, has remained silent on the issue. And also, the bishop, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has said he does not want to go down this path of denying Catholic politicians communion. He, in fact, spearheaded an effort to try to delay this conversation a bit until bishops could meet in person. And the newly appointed bishop of Wilmington, Delaware, has not come out either way, but has signaled early on that he agrees that he does not want to go down the path of denying politicians communion. So there is some reticence among the bishops who will actually be charged with deciding about communion for the president to kind of go down this path. But it does seem that we're going to sort of head into a series of debates about communion. It seems likely that bishops will vote to move ahead with adopting some kind of statement. And I'm curious, Sam, you drafted a piece for America about communion wars. Are we about to enter into another round of communion wars, and who wins?
Well, I think in many ways we're already in another round of communion wars right now. And sadly, I think the answer is that no one wins, right? That there are, I would say, real and good pastoral objectives held by people on both sides of this debate, right? On the one hand, the pastoral objective of greater coherence in the life of the church, and the Eucharist and our hunger for the Eucharist really being something that drives us to a fuller embrace of justice for every human being, right? And that is a laudable and wonderful, beautiful pastoral goal. And on the other hand, there's the pastoral goal of deeper unity in the life of the church, that we should be able to find ways to cooperate across our differences and even across political differences, that the church's interior life shouldn't become so closely tracked to partisan divides in the U.S. that we become either a church only of one side or parishes of only one side or another within the life of the church. And right now, those pastoral goals seem to be in tension with each other, right? And so the piece I wrote, I argued that no one can win these communion wars right now, right? That this kind of that having this argument and this that would result in explicit discipline at the communion rail, at the moment of distributing communion, that actually can't either move the people who need to be moved more towards justice effectively, nor can it actually deepen unity in the life of the church right now. It's going to inevitably be seen as, this is my argument at least, it's going to be inevitably seen as giving the win to one or the other side of an issue that has become almost entirely partisan in the United States. And that's really tragic, because underneath that is that the call for greater Eucharistic unity and greater Eucharistic coherence, as Vatican II says, that's the source and summit of the life of the church, the Eucharist. And we're fighting about it at the peripheries, right? We're fighting about it where it's most contentious. And what we're losing in that is, as you said earlier in this conversation, the fact that fundamentally all the bishops agree on the theology of the Eucharist, and all the bishops agree in being pro-life, that we need to defend the life of the unborn. And yet we're having this massive fight around how those two issues intersect. And yeah, I don't think that's a war that is going to have any victors in the life of the church, unfortunately.
Yeah, you can read Father Sam Sawyer's essay about the communion wars and lots more on this topic, including what's next for this process, where we might go with the proposed statement on the Eucharist, and why we're focused on abortion and not other issues. Lots of insight, analysis, and commentary at americamagazine.org. Father Sam Sawyer, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. It's been great to be here.
You can read Father Sam's essay at americamagazine.org, where there's lots more analysis, commentary, and news about this ongoing debate about the Eucharist in the life of the Church. I'm Michael Lachlan, national correspondent for America Media. Thanks for joining us today.